Okay guys, so in this video we're going to talk a little bit about production testing. So let's get into it. And basically what we're going to cover is what does prod testing mean, or production testing, and why do we want to do production testing, what issues do we face with production testing, and how can we solve these problems. So testing in production is one of the most controversial things that you can probably possibly suggest at a company, because the usual consensus is that this is a really, really bad idea. And the reason why it's a very bad idea is basically because, as you can imagine, if you're running tests against a live system, like, the least of your worries is going to be the possibility of you breaking something. You're releasing application code into your production environment that may or may not be tested, or you might be creating a bunch of fake accounts that you use. And then the problem with fake accounts is, of course, that you need to somehow have a way to deal with that. Either you're fine with having fake data and fake orders or something like that in your system, or perhaps you want to do some type of cleanup, or maybe you need some special type of logic that is going to fire off if, let's say for the sake of argument, that, oh, if this is a test user, then you want this thing number A to happen, or A to happen, but if it's not a test user, it's going to be B that happens. It is a really, really tricky thing, this. It's a really, really hard thing, I would say. So what I'm going to show you now is a way to deal with production testing, and I will tell you how you can solve it in a nice-ish way, but it's also, I'm just going to be completely honest with you, extremely hard to do this and extremely hard to get it right. So first and foremost, the normal problem people have with testing in production is that they're gonna go and say, oh, but Frederick, does that mean that we're gonna test our code in production without testing then we don't know if it's gonna work? Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you should still have a testing pyramid in place, where the lowest level is going to be your unit test, followed by your integration, or let's call them integration tests for the sake of argument, and followed by ideally some type of testing manual process where you figure things out. You have test environments and things like that where you can do acceptance testing, things of this nature. And then the problem with that is usually, as I was saying, like, a lot of people they don't want to run their test in production, but at the same time, nothing is closer to production than production. So if you can run your tests in production without any risk to your system, it's the best thing for you. So I would even go as far as to say that some applications almost require you to be able to do that, especially, let's say, if you have an extremely integration heavy application, that is very, very tricky for you to test without running in the live system. You might have tons of different integrations to different companies, and like, they don't want to maintain a testing environment for you. They just say, oh yeah, this is our APIs, you can connect to them, and you kind of go, okay, but I need to run some test queries and stuff like that. And then they kind of go, well, yeah, but we don't really want to invest a lot of time and money into this. So, like, I don't know what to tell you. This is the API. And then they might have things like throttling as another example. They might not allow you to run in enormous amounts of queries, stuff like that. It's a very tricky thing. So the way that I've solved this so far, I've only had to do this once before, where a company really wanted to go heavy on this, where we kind of had to figure this out. It worked really, I would say, really well, in a sense, and there were a few things that I wanted to improve, and now I have the opportunity to do this again, where I'm dealing with my current company, where the same sort of discussion has come to play. So I'm going to show you the proposal that I gave to my company, and that I think is going to be the direction that we're going to move. So basically, your problem is going to be two main things. Number one is, records. Now, we have a requirement on us that basically states that, oh, if you're going to run production testing at a high frequency, because remember now, if you're running a few manual tests within your production environment, it's very important for you to start talking to your stakeholders and make sure that, hey, you know what, we're going to do some manual testing. I hope that's okay, because their metric is going to be off. Like, some orders are going to be fake, some are not going to be fake, and stuff like that. So you have to have a dialogue about it. But when you step that up to, let's say that you're actually automating tests in production, then the whole conversation becomes much, much trickier, because then you might have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records or different events that take place in metrics gathering and stuff like that that are not supposed to be in the database, or rather they give you a false picture of what's going on in the system. So the way that I've dealt with this before is to make sure that you have a way to add meta information to the records that you are creating. Now I'm going to show you an example of how to do this. So here I have a little Express server, and here is my application. It's a very simple application where we just have a get and a post, and all it's going to do is that it's going to get all the users, or it's going to create a user, and it's just going to create a random user with some information. And then we have a service here as traditional layered application structure to the whole thing, where we're going to save the user, and then we have a metrics service that is going to say user signed up, user ID, etc., right? And that's the whole flow. So if I now go to my terminal here and I say npm start, let's do that, and then let's say curl http://host 3000. I'm gonna get some records here, and here you can see a bunch of records that are in my database at this moment. I can also show you here in my little nice UI from Mongo Hub. It's a nice little application for us Mac users. So we have a few records here, right? So this is just a record. Now, the problem here is that, let's say for the sake of argument that this was an actual user. Then I want this user to be in the system. But let's say that you have a metrics gathering system or something like that that is now going to track how many users do you have within the system? Well, if you're running automated testing that's creating a bunch of fake accounts into this environment, that information is going to be completely wrong. It might be okay with a few test users, but if you have a lot of them, that's going to create a big problem. And you might say that, oh, okay, Frederick, but maybe I should just create some test accounts. And I kind of go, well, yeah, you can create special user types that you can pretty much just have, right? The problem with that is that if you have a special type of user, then everywhere in the code that you are going to perform an operation that might be something you don't want to happen if there is a test user, you're going to have to do this. If user.test or is test user, then do A, otherwise do B. And this becomes really hard really quickly, because that basically means that whenever you're developing a feature, you always have to have the mindset that, okay, I want this to happen, but if the user is a test user, I want that to happen. And that is, I can just tell you, almost impossible. It's almost impossible to not get that wrong in some sense, in some fashion. So what I argue is that it is in your greatest interest to make the surface area of where you decide if this is a test user or if there's a specific behavior as low as humanly possible. Now, the way I will argue that there is only one, in my opinion, situation where you want to create an if statement and have a different behavior depending on if this is a test user or if it's not. And that is when you are sending out information that is external, and where you don't control the external source. An example would be, let's say that you run some tests that are going to place an order in some other vendor system. Let's say that you have a web shop and you have a supplier or something like that, and you're sending orders to them. Well, they're probably not going to be very happy with you if you have a bunch of tests that are running in production, or you sit there and click and just try sending orders and they all get a bunch of fake orders. That might damage your relationship with them. Now, you can you can just say within your company that, okay, we're going to test everything except for that thing. And that's fine, but I also argue that another nice way to solve that sort of situation is that, okay, if you have a service that represents you connecting to that external resource that you don't control, there you might want to put an if-else condition or something like that, or create a test bubble. But a test bubble is a much more complicated structure that basically means that you would have a proxy outside of your system. So this code here would connect out to a proxy, and that proxy would check on the network call and see if this is a test request or if it's an actual request. If it is a test request, it will simply return some mock fake data or something like that. You can make that a lot more elaborate and a lot more complex, but we'll cover that in a different video. What we're going to focus on is the stuff that we own ourselves. And this is where I argue that it's much better for you to label the records and clean them up rather than try to create a bunch of if-else statements so that you have different behaviors depending on whether or not you're a test user. Because if you do that, you simplify your logic, like your business logic just stays the same. You don't have a bunch of test code and test cases in your application logic, which means that you can deal with scalability and maintaining the code and keeping it clean much easier, and then you can still remove the records afterwards. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. How do we make sure that we know what records to clean up? I'm glad you asked. So here is my libraries here, and here I have a bunch of services, and I just have two services, a user service and a metrics service. Now these are just abstractions that I, at a high level, that I just try to, I'm just trying to get you into the mind space that usually you have something that might gather metrics. It's very common that your system has like mix panel events or some other log system or something like that, that's an external service that you are buying from some other company, and they just log data for you that you can have business people that they can run analytics on, etc., etc., etc. Now that's one thing, like it's an external system, but you still own it. You can still do things with the records that you are creating. And then you have internal services, things that you directly control, like a database or something like that just goes directly into your own VPC or like your own network. So what I suggest you do is that you do something like this. You create a test variable or some type of meta information that you can apply to the records that you are creating. So if we have a look here, if I do node and npm start like this, and then I do a post to my endpoint there, you'll notice that the record that I just got back is pretty much the same thing, but it has test set to true. And that's pretty much the whole idea here, where you can you add meta information to the record in the database. You don't need to add it to the models, because it doesn't matter to the models that this is a test record, because the system should just operate as, oh, this is just another user. The logic should never have to consider whether or not this is a test user or not, because we don't care if it's a test user when we're actually testing our system and when we're working with it. The only thing we want to be sure about is that we don't create any destructive action or something that would distort our understanding of what the state of the database is. Because now that I have labeled this record here, I can go to my database here and I can see, okay, so this is a test record, or rather this is a normal record, and this is a test record. Oh, and this is a test record. So it's now very easy for me to just remove these records. I can create a batch job. I can do whatever I want. This is of course manual, but I could, as I was saying, I could just have a special command that I run when all my testing is done that just clears up all of the records in my system that are labeled as test. Now you can do the same thing. You don't have to write a test property or something like that. You can do the same thing with specific users or stuff like that. But basically what you're after here is that you need a way to track what data is real and what data is fake. That's basically the whole thing. Now, the way that I like to do this, that I think works really, really well, is to do it at the lowest level possible. So in my user service here, you'll notice that I use Mongoose, And so I've created a user service that extends a storage service, and we're going to touch on that in just a moment. And then I store my model, and here I take in the model, I pass it to my parent, and I just store it like this, and then I have get all users, this.model.find, get user, which is just going to find it by ID. And then there's one difference here. You don't have to do, you could just put all of this into helper functions as well, but there's one catch here. So save user does this.save save user instead of user.save. And for those of you who are accustomed to using Mongoose, you know that if you have a model, what you usually do is that you create a new instance of that model and then you call .save on that instance, and then that's pretty much it. This is not what we're doing, because what we want is to be able to let this code here be clean from any notion of testing. And as I was saying, when I save a record, I need a way to determine if this user has been created in a test scenario or if this user has been created just normally. I need to know that somewhere, but I don't want it to pollute my business logic. So I put it in a storage service. So here is my storage service. And the storage service is very simple. It basically takes in an entity of some sort. We can actually look at that. So these are the basic interfaces. Nothing super special. Now I have actually added test here to the user schema just for completeness sake, but you can just pretend that this is either not there or it's a property that you shouldn't be using. But for the interface's sake, I'm just doing that right now. So here we have our storage service, and as you can see here, all it does is that it has a save function that takes in any type of data. It doesn't matter what it is, it doesn't care what data it is. Now we're assuming that this is an object, but anywho, then it in turn is extending the prod testing service, and you'll see that in a moment as well, where we are just calling this, maybe add test metadata. Not the prettiest name in the world, but it gets the job done. And then it instantiates a version of the model that I passed in, and then it calls save, just as you would have from pretty much any normal case. And here is the prod testing service. This is it. All it has is this check if we're in a test environment. If we are, then it's going to add, now in this case it's just one single property that it adds to the record. Now notice how abstract this is. It really doesn't care. It can be anything. It could be a user, a product, a cart, it doesn't matter. The only thing this service cares about is the lowest level thing possible. So I have a record and I need to somehow persist this record, but sometimes I want it to be just a record, just as in this case, and sometimes I want there to be a test, like a property on top, so that I know that, oh, this was a test. That means that later on when the test is done, I can just remove all of this test data in production. Because remember, in production, there is no way for you to know. Like if you're running like a separate database or something like you do when you do your own local tests, then you're not running in production. That's the problem with running in production, that you can't just dump the whole database, because then you would lose all your data. So this is pretty much it, and this works for the metric service as well. Like the metric service here is also fairly simple. All this does is that it calls the prod testing service, and then it adds the like this is a little bit more verbose than I would like it. If I were to rework this, I would probably do something similar to the storage service here and create another layer so that this doesn't have to be there. And then you would simply make the external network call. Let's just pretend that this is like going to some metrics logging system or a log system out there in the internet. And then you would know that this record is a test record, so that you could clean up those records in the external system as well. So this is pretty much it. And then when you're doing your testing, what ideally you want to do is that you would deploy a dedicated instance, something like you would create, say, 2 different domains. You would have your main domain, which all the users are going to, and then you would go into something like I don't know, let's say that you're Google and most users go to google.com, but when you're running your tests, the testers and the automatic tests, they go to test.google.com. And in that environment, you have flipped on this test variable, so that server knows that, all right, I'm running in a test mode here. It's the same application, it's the same environment, everything is the same. The only difference is that the environmental variable is different. It's just flipped. And now that that's flipped, that means that all the records that are being created through that subdomain is now being labeled as test records. And then when everything is said and done, you simply run a cleanup job and all the records are cleaned up again. This is still not perfect, as I was saying. It's still not going to be a perfect fit, but this works very nicely. And there are still tons of other things that are not covered by this, but hopefully I have given you like a hint as to how to think about testing in production. So what I want you to take away from this is that production testing is extremely hard to do. It's extremely risky, and you really need to think it through. But if you do and you can make it work, it is probably the best way of testing that there is, because you're literally running, there's no difference between your test environment and the production environment, because you're running in the actual environment that all your users are using. So when you want to do this is usually when you're dealing with an integration heavy application, where you might have a bunch of different other companies that are connected to your system, and there's no real way for you to simulate how everything's going to work in your local environment or some test environment, because they don't give you like test boxes or stuff like that. You always have to, if you want to do the integration, you have to do it live. You have to do it towards their system. And when that is the case, it's a very complicated situation, but you will usually have to go into production testing of some sort to make this work, or to create a test bubble or something like that, which is a different video, which is also extremely complicated. So if you can avoid having to make things this complicated, that's great. But if you want to do production testing, this is a good hint, I would say, as to how to deal with it. Have a great day.